Here we are, in the middle of nowhere. The birds are, well, they're not singing that much these days. A little bit too hot, they're having a rest. Only mad dogs and Englishmen are out here in the midday sun. I'm neither English or a mad dog, so what does that make me? Who knows? Now I want you to remember 3 years. 1914, 1994, 2020. That's 106 years between 1914 and 2020. They're interlinked. Now, you know, during the past 2 years we've been talking about deregulation and globalisation and corporatisation and privatisation. And we've made many points about privatisation, which I'd like to go through step by step, and then look at 1914, 1994, 2020, and look at the greatest stupidity that we've seen in this nation since Federation. After Federation, various governments of various political hues set in mode a train of events which led to the state providing necessary, essential services for the people of this country. We had the state creating the Commonwealth Bank in 1911, Australia Post, the Snowy Hydro scheme, and the list goes on and on. Qantas, Telstra, or Telecom as it used to be known. And then with the election of the Keating Hawke government, or the Hawke-Keating government, we saw around the world the triumph of neoliberalism. And state assets which had been built up through the blood, sweat and tears of people in this country through the taxation system was virtually given away to the private sector. And we saw this in many, many fields of human endeavour, and we were told that prices would decrease. The first thing people learnt is that public assets do not belong to the public. Not one of our public assets ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution. Public assets belong to the government of the day, and the government of the day can at any time it likes, maybe to fill a financial black hole, a budgetary deficit, sell public assets. Now, public assets not only provide essential services, they create competition in a mixed economy. So instead of having 2 or 3 corporations as we now have manipulating or dominating every level of human activity in this country, you would have direct competition between the public and private sector. Nothing highlighted this more than the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. Because once the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, it was let's not forget that it was the process that began with the Labor government. Once it was privatised, the Big Four had minimal competition and basically had a cartel type of arrangement as far as financial services and banking services was concerned. So what's this got to do with 1914, 1994 and 2020? Well, in my opinion, what occurred in those 3 epochs highlights the stupidity, the ignorance, the dangers associated with the privatisation of public assets which are created to provide essential services for people in this country. The other thing public assets do, although some are losses, most public assets make a profit. And that profit goes back to the Treasury. And once that public asset is sold, the ability to make that profit and create that service disappears. The privatisation of Medibank Private by the Abbott-led government saw the carnage that occurred in the private health insurance industry as a result of the privatisation of Medibank Private. If there's one thing Abbott should never be forgiven for, and there are many things he shouldn't be forgiven for, is the privatisation of Medibank Private. And all those elderly people with private insurance who voted for him need to understand that the situation they find themselves in, as far as the private insurance fiasco is concerned, is totally related to the privatisation of Medibank Private. So let's get back to 1914. What happened in 1914? Well, World War I happened. But as far as Australia was concerned, the Australian government created the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, commonly known as CSL, as a public institution to provide vaccines to the people of this country. This was 5 years before the influenza pandemic in 1919. And between 1914 and June 1994, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories was one of the most important public institutions in this country. It not only provided vaccines for the Australian people at cost price, it also provided blood products, which are essential in a modern hospital system, and it also provided antivenines, which are essential in a country like Australia where 5,000 people are bitten by snakes on average every year. So the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory provided an essential service. It provided employment for scientists and technicians through the Commonwealth Public Service who were able to create new vaccines, test vaccines that came in from overseas, create many of the antivenines which we take for granted today as far as snakes and spiders are concerned, something we expect to be able to be administered to any Australian within a few hours of them being bitten by a snake or a poisonous spider. So it provided an essential, important, fundamental service to the people of this country at a minimal cost. It also provided training opportunities. It allowed the public sector to check private vaccines to ensure they met the standards that were necessary in this country. So what happened in June 1994? Well, in June 1994, the darling of the left, the darling of the Labor Party, Mr. Paul Keating, Prime Minister of Australia, accidental Prime Minister, privatised the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. The share price was set at $2.99, and the Commonwealth government, the Keating government, made $299 million. $299 million, which is a drop in the ocean, with the privatisation of an essential service which had been set up by the Billy Hughes-led Labor government in 1914. So, let's switch the clock forward to 2020. 26 years later. 26 years later, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And there are institutes and private pharmaceutical companies around the world trying to develop a vaccine which most likely will be developed in the next 6 to 12 months. Not only developed, but people start to receive the vaccine for the next 6 to 12 months. So what happens in Australia in 2020? The share price of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, which is listed on the stock exchange, is now $311 per share. It was sold by the Keating-led Labor government for $2.99. 16 years later, it has increased in price by 115-fold, $311 per share. This is a rich company. It provides extraordinary dividends to its shareholders. Now, the Morrison-led Labor government, spooked by the problem that there is no public Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, has been strong-armed by the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, a privately owned company, to give them $1.2 billion grant. Corporate welfare of $1.2 billion because CSL was making noises they couldn't extend, modernise their Melbourne vaccine production without government assistance. This is a corporation whose share price is $311 per share. This is a corporation which is making extraordinary profits, and they get a $1.2 billion government grant. So they will continue to manufacture and provide vaccines for the Australian people. Think about it. 1914, public company. 1994, company privatised. 2020, the taxpayer, you, governments, giving this organisation $1.2 billion to continue vaccine production in this country. Now, what would have occurred if the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory had not been privatised in 1994, as Telecom was privatised, Qantas was privatised, many of this country's ports were privatised, all the airports were privatised, and the list goes on and on. What would have happened in 2020? One, we would have had a company which was publicly owned, 106 years old, with a long tradition, which was training scientists and technicians to do research into the production of vaccines. So in 2020, we could have had a company that had the full support of the federal government, because it was publicly owned, to actually do research in the production of a COVID-19 vaccine. We could have had a company whose research into venom antidotes could have expanded exponentially. We could have had a company which was at the leading edge of scientific research in this country. We would have had a company which would have guaranteed that Australians would have access to the latest vaccines, the latest antivenins, the latest blood products. So, what do we have in 2020? We have a federal government which is so frightened about a private corporation, Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, leaving the country, that it is willing to give them a taxpayer gift of $1.2 billion in order to provide vaccines to this country for 10 years after 2026. Not one of our cringing, carping political representatives arced up about this. Not one of our federal politicians had the brains to say, why don't we use this $1.2 billion as a down payment on the creation of another publicly owned pharmaceutical corporation which could not only provide antivenins, vaccinations, blood products, and do research in order to deal with ongoing pandemics, but we could have a reservoir of talent, a reservoir of trained scientists and technicians who could be at the cutting edge of scientific advancement as far as health is concerned on the planet, which was publicly owned, whose benefits would flow not only to the people of this country, but the people in the Pacific who are aligned to Australia, who currently are looking elsewhere for support as this government privatisation agenda ignores not only us, but them. So there are options. There have always been options. And 106 years ago, the Commonwealth Government had the foresight to understand that essential services should not be in the hands of a private corporation. In 2020, 106 years later, we have forgotten that valuable lesson. And we are paying the price in many, many ways. And this is just one example of the price that is paid when a public service, a public institution, which provides an essential service to the people of this country is privatised. Not only do we lose access to that essential service, a guaranteed access to that service, as we've seen with the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory fiasco, corporate welfare at its best, but we lose the ability for the government to have an income stream from that public asset. We lose the ability to actually have real competition in a privately owned economy where the public sector can compete on an equal footing with the private sector. Think about it. There are many fields of human endeavour in this country that have been privatised, and we are paying the price. It's time we had a political movement, a social movement, a cultural movement which was willing to reverse this trend, and that's what public interest before corporate interest is all about. It is one of the planks, the major planks of our platform. The provision of essential services through public institutions which are publicly owned and whose ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution in order to ensure that in the future we will not have another Hawke or another Keating or another Howard or another Morrison who are willing to sell what has been built in this country through the blood, sweat and tears of past generations to provide essential services for future generations.